think an invitation to come and give a lecture here is good for one's character. Because first you're flattered that the National Institute of Advanced Studies thinks you're good enough to speak. And then you come into this hall, which has been designed to make you feel small. So it's very good for one's character to do this. Now, if you add to the fact there are a lot of empty chairs in the hall, you know where you stand. So I thank you very much for this opportunity. When Dr. Narasimhan called me to talk about this particular talk, I went through a number of possible ideas that we could talk about. But I chose this whole question of experimentation and replication for the simple reason that it's been bothering me for some time now, particularly because of the glib manner in which major agencies that fund very large projects will only fund projects if they are replicable in some sense. So you want to improve the usage of water in Karnataka, you have a watershed project in Kabbalanala, can you extend it to the rest of Karnataka, at least if not to the rest of India? If you can do it, you will get large chunks of money. But what about the practicality of it? What is involved in this kind of replication? I think very little is discussed about it. It is just assumed that money is well spent if it is spent on something that is replicable. So I thought that it is worth thinking a little deeper about this particular issue, not for any major reasons coming from the history of ideas and so on, but because here is one particular idea that is being used in this rather simple-minded manner, and I thought that this is an opportunity to explore that. I'd like to basically say that I'm responding to probably what can be called donor phobia in this. Now, how can we deal with this? I think the word replicable comes, as Dr. Narasimhan, somewhere from experiment. But what is the nature of experiment? I'm not a scientist, but to my understanding it is that if you have some kind of a hunch, you set up an experiment where you follow certain steps, you try to create an environment in which what you think should happen will happen, observe, report your results, and then the rest of the academic community will look at it. If they feel first your hunch is worth something, that the results you're reporting are worth something, and then they try to do the same thing. And in this process, a dialogue is set up which will either result in a rejection of that particular hypothesis or in it going on for a while till somebody bright enough rejects it. In the process, the kind of thinking around that particular experiment becomes a little more sophisticated. You start by saying that, look, there is a situation in which we can mix hydrogen and oxygen and get water. And people do it in many places under different conditions, and then they observe that, yes, indeed, here are two molecules you can mix, you get a new one which has different properties, and then somebody says, oh, but are they only these two? Can't we mix other molecules? And so on. So a process starts from in which you first generalize by saying, under certain conditions, two molecules can be mixed, which create a third one with different properties. And then you generalize, and then you say, different molecules can be mixed to create others which have different properties, and so on. And very soon you find that this can become the basis of an industry. The entire pharma industry now is based on, finding molecules that have various medical properties and so on. So this seems to be one way in which you can talk about experimentation and replication, and there is a certain validity to that process. But what are the parameters within which this kind of experimentation can be done? I think it is reasonably limited. It is very specific ideas at a practical level. Well, practical may not be the right word, but it's very specific ideas that are worked upon, experimented with, and lead to it. And in the sciences, these experiments can become extremely complex over a period of time as the ideas behind them grow and develop. Now, to what extent can we talk of the replicability of an experiment? I suppose that when it comes to certain basic properties of nature and so on, it doesn't really matter whether you're in Delhi or Beijing or London or whatever, but you throw up an apple, it comes down in the same way. And there are certain properties that you generalize across. Now, this is because you're dealing with properties of nature, and the parameters that you define are such that it doesn't matter which place you are in. Therefore, when we talk of experiment and replication, it is necessary to talk of those parameters. And I would suggest that when they're fairly narrow parameters, and the experiment you can do can be in some degree of detail. The replication can be in some degree of detail, and you can start refining it as the parameters change within reasonable degrees. This has all come from the natural sciences. I don't know anything of physics except what little I might have learned in school and which I've probably forgotten long since. But when we talk of science, what exactly are we talking about? I think there are two distinct meanings of this word that are commonly mixed up, not followed up, and so on. One is, when you talk about science, you talk of a subject. Physics is a subject of study, it's a science. You say science and physics, and go ahead. And along with it goes a certain tradition of work, tradition of research, which goes with it. But in another sense, the word science is also used more for a discipline of work, more of a methodology, of an approach. So if you study a subject according to certain principles where you search for data, you try to explain the data, you try to build theories on the basis of data and advance the subject. And this is what I mean by a scientific approach, a methodology of work. Then you say that it's academic work, it's a science, and then that's why you get a whole series of adjectives before the word science, human science, social science, biological science, whatever, where there is a certain definition of a discipline or an area of study, which is studied according to certain methods which you call scientific and respectable. In many of these, experiments and replication have a certain role. And psychology, for example, would probably qualify into the borderline of the social sciences. There's a lot of experimentation that goes on in sociology, and very careful interpretation of those results, even if they are applicable. But I'm not very sure that that is all there is to science. I think there is another part, particularly when you talk of the natural sciences and physics and so on, where the effort is to theorize in such a way that you build on certain basic principles and create a kind of filing system where, as knowledge approaches, you can, from basic and primary principles, build up that structure. And the study and the experimentation goes on so that a certain amount of assumptions are made based on past work, and then you build a little brick and build it further. So that the discipline in that sense is a kind of formal logic. You have certain basic principles that are accepted for either on faith or whatever, and then you build on it, and it becomes a complex structure that is applied in various kinds of contexts. And in this, experiments have a definite role to play, because every time there is a hunch or a hypothesis, something, it has to be tested. And if tested and so on, various things follow. Now, what about other disciplines? In my talk, we have in the title the word social sciences. What are the social sciences? Now, many scientists have felt fit to philosophize and write about meta-science and things of that sort, and most of the big scientists have written on this, and I'm sure in this audience most of you would be familiar with it. But I thought for my purposes, I would pick up on the work of one of the very few economists who has written on this kind of an issue, a Romanian economist called Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen, who also happens to be a pretty accomplished engineer if you read his works, because the book I'm drawing upon is called The Entropy Law and the Economic Process. And obviously from the use of the word entropy, he has gone through the relevant literature in physics, etc., before he's come to these positions. I won't dwell on this, but he has his own positions on the debates in quantum mechanics and things like that. He's scholarly enough to do that. But he's an economist. He was a professor at Vanderbilt University in the US. And he argues on the basis of his own scholarly work that there is a kind of continuum in which one studies the world around us. You have the world of atoms, you have the world of subatomic particles at the other end going on, and then from atoms you get molecules, you get into life sciences, biology, organic sciences, and then what he calls the superorganic, which is really studies of society. It could be sociology, economics, or whatever, depending upon how you slice the topics that you're working with. And in this particular spectrum, while his early argumentation is based upon his understanding of the natural sciences and so on, which I will just take for granted and not repeat, the argument, he says, is that when it comes to society, and particularly human society, there is one feature that distinguishes human beings from all other life forms. And this he calls the ability of human beings to, as he says, use exosomatic instruments of production. Now, if you have a tiger, it has its body and it has power in its body and it hunts using that body and its speed and its strength. But when it comes to human beings, he says they don't depend just upon their bodies, which is somatic, but they have extra somatic. So you create spades and spears and plows and CNC machines and all kinds of things to aid you in the production process. So that the human species, he says, the only one that is not limited by the body it is born with, but which it creates instruments, exosomatic instruments, which it builds into the production process. And this differentiates human society from other forms of life and takes it into. Possibly, yes. But those are still very simple tools compared to what human beings have done. And that is the point he makes. Jürgen then takes the point that for these kind of sciences, you cannot have the approach that you have in physics, where you have a basic logic, some basic axioms from which you build based on some theory, a kind of structure. These are the human sciences have a kind of different format. And while you should certainly follow a rigorous study methodology, he doesn't use the word science because he says once you cross chemistry or somewhere, these are not sciences at all. You have to use rigorous methods of study. And he says that for these subjects, it's not so much experimentation and so on as what he calls the analytical simile. You study a phenomenon, you record it, certain things happen. He says this then serves as a simile, which you should use in your thinking process. And when you find in some other area or some other area of endeavor, similar kinds of incidents, it should be a starting point, but it is a simile, which means there are certain points of difference. It's a starting point for thinking, it's analytical, but that's about all. And from that you break off. What then is the point of break off? Why is it that you cannot replicate? In this particular form of thinking, the use of exosomatic instruments of production is a starting process in which human beings have to be arranged in different forms of teams, different groups of various kinds. Relationship between groups become important. These are extremely complex structures. And he says that whenever you identify any of these tend to be unique. Now, it's not a question of the solar system where there are millions of stars whirling around suns and things happening in predictable ways. He says in each of these cases, this is a unique system. And if you're looking at unique systems, then at best, experience from elsewhere is an analytical simile, but there is very little in terms of experimentation or replication that would come your way. He gives a number of issues. He builds this in a number of ways. He says one of the core elements of human society as it involves with the use of exosomatic instruments as well is that there is a lot of creativity taking place. In the process of evolution and growth, these societies face different problems. For example, the fact that the population itself grows leads to pressure on resources, on the environment and so on, to which they find solutions which are unique solutions. And it is in the nature of this kind of a social process that in each case you have to innovate and find your own solution. You do not repeat what has happened in history. He says that the difference between what human societies experience and what happens in the natural sciences is that human societies have a history. You inherit something, people act in certain ways, people contribute to history, and history moves in unpredictable directions. But it is unique. There is only one particular historical process. You cannot move back, and you do not know which way you move forward. You do participate in the making of future events, but you don't really direct them. Things happen as a result of your actions, particularly in the larger historical frame. And he attributes this to what he calls the flow of consciousness, which is critical of life. So the flow of consciousness in human societies, its arrangement into various kinds of groups that interact in the process of production with exosomatic instruments, leads to unique societies happening, for each of which there will be unique solutions. Now, if you're going to talk in such terms, for each society, there might be a lot that is common because it's human society. There might be a lot that can be learned. Speech is common, although languages are different. People eat, although the foods they eat are different. People produce in agriculture, but the climate and methods are different. So he says, while yes, there is a certain amount of commonality, that's only a starting point. That where the growth urge and creative urge comes from your response to the specific in your own creative and innovative manner. Phenomena tend to be unique. They do not occur in large numbers. The parameters in which they occur are changing very rapidly, and they're changing. There are large numbers of them changing very fast. So with each situation, you are in something of a unique position. Now what happens in this is the kind of situation that the theory of chaos and things describe, but they don't tell you the future. I mean, once a thing has happened, you know the initial conditions, and then you can explain it in a particular kind of a model, mathematical model, using various kinds of tools. But till now, there is no real way of saying, as a result of all this, what will happen tomorrow. So induction is an intuitive process. It doesn't have the same kind of rigor as the deductive processes. There is an element of creativity. There is an element of innovation. Some of it could be random. Some of it could be sought for. After all, in a large number of industries today, innovations are sought for. They're planned for. In industries like the computer industry, you say that, look, I'm going to get this particular kind of a processor, you work for it and you get it. But these are very limited instances. In the larger society, things that happen are very much larger. Now, if this is the context in which we understand societies, what is this whole business of replicability? I'd like to take two examples and show that the notion of replicability actually lands you in trouble. One is something that will be pretty well known to most of you. This is the effort in India to improve literacy, the National Literacy Mission. Now, where did the National Literacy Mission get its basic model, its ideas from? It came from the success of Ernakulam district in Kerala, which was the first district in this country to be declared fully literate, 100% literate. Now, what was the situation in Ernakulam before this particular event, say 1 or 2 years before this particular event? I think it was reasonably simple. Kerala has had large literacy movements. They've had trade unions, they've had movements, religious movements, all kinds of things where people were mobilized into sense of rights, into the understanding and demand for the advantages of education and so on. And about the time when the Kerala Shastra Sahitya Parishad, the KSSP, began to get into this act, the census had shown that the number of illiterates in Ernakulam district was 600 something. Now, if 600 people could be made literate, the district would be 100% literate because the census said all the others were literate. Well, we're using literacy, which is a rather minimal sort of level of achievement. But it was 600 people. And the model that evolved is that college teachers, volunteers from the KSSP and others would volunteer time over weekends, over evenings and so on, search out these 600 people, teach them to read and write, and they would pass a particular test that was accepted as the test for literacy. And on that basis, all the 600 odd people were made literate. This was tested, it was vouchsafed for, and then Ernakulam was declared a 100% district. Now, this had an electrifying effect on the country. Everyone wanted their district to become 100% literate. What followed as the government of India took it up, the National Literacy Mission was an important thing. The people who played a key role in the Ernakulam work had important positions in it, and a model was developed by which college teachers, professors in local colleges and so on would volunteer time, would seek out illiterates in their area, and would teach them to the point where they would become literate. Now, the National Literacy Mission was organized along these lines. It ran for several years, but when the next census came along, it didn't show there was much of a dent. And then there was a whole soul searching and a review. Now just imagine the model that is there and then think of Madhya Pradesh. Now you had 600 people illiterate in the district of Ernakulam. You probably have 600 literate people in the district of Indore or Dhar or Sarguja or someplace like that, in a population of 3 lakhs, 4 lakhs, 5 lakhs, which is the typical population of a district. Now, the scale of the problem is different, the context of the problem is different. The entire history in Kerala, where there were movements, people conscious of the need to learn to read and write, where everyone, where there are newspapers which would report events that people wanted to know about, and compared it to Sarguja or Shahdol district in Madhya Pradesh, where there would be 4 or 5 lakh people, apathetic, few hundred literate who couldn't care less about what is happening in society. And what is the scale of the problem in which you're getting volunteer teachers in colleges, well-meaning people, probably hardworking people, but the scale of the problem is such that there is really no hope of success unless you have a very much better way of doing it. And it's not a great surprise to me that looking back, I mean, this is not something I would have said at that point in time, but when you look back on it, to take a success in one part of the country, which is a genuine success we should be proud of, see how it was organized and then transplant it, replicate it into other states, where did it lead you? Now, Madhya Pradesh is a good point to talk about because Madhya Pradesh took the conscious decision to forget about the National Literacy Mission, the adult education program and so on. And they innovated. I want to use the example of Madhya Pradesh further because if you looked at the last census, you would find that it is the state that has made the most dramatic advances in literacy between 91 and 2001. In fact, my friends in the education department here don't believe me when I point out that female literacy in Madhya Pradesh is 2% higher in Madhya Pradesh than in Karnataka. Now, this is a progressive southern state. We've been resting on our laurels, that's a progressive southern state. But this so-called Bimaru state has worked, and its female literacy is 2% higher than Karnataka in a period of 10 years, which I think is an astounding achievement. Overall increase of more than 20%, so that Madhya Pradesh is now above the national average for literacy, female literacy higher than Karnataka. And that's something that, in the sense of competitive politics, should play an important part. How did Madhya Pradesh achieve this? Not by the National Literacy Mission and by replicating that particular model, but by realizing that this is not going to work. By saying that the scale of the problem in Madhya Pradesh is different, the society is different, the priorities of the people for education are different because you can become literate, but it doesn't make a difference to your earning capacity in the marketplace. And therefore, people don't see any particular need for it. It's a society in which girls are married off at 8 or 9 years old, and then once they're married off, nobody cares about their education. There are a lot of social constraints that have to be dealt with. They did basically 2 things. One is the chief minister questioned the education department, which made a claim that there is a school in every village. He says, if there is a school in every village, why is literacy so low? And on examination, it turned out that village meant what the British called the revenue village, which is an artificial settlement covering what would be 8 or 9 habitations. And in one of those habitations, there would be a school of the education department. But in the statistics of the education department, it is what they called a DL school, which is a door-locked school. There was a school where there was no teacher. And it's not very surprising. So the problem in Madhya Pradesh basically was one of access. Even in the settlement where there was a school, you couldn't have children from the other settlements because these are far away. They'd be 5-6 miles away. There could be a stream in between or a hill in between. There could be a jungle. Children couldn't go. So having looked at this and found out that it is access, the state government broke that old model and said that we will put up in any village where there are at least 25 children, we will put up a school. The textbooks will be the same as prescribed by the National Literacy Mission. That work need not be redone. There are textbooks that exist. There are minimum levels of learning. We would like the sarpanch of that village to select somebody from the village who would be the school teacher, who is given the fancy title of Guruji. And this Guruji would then be given training by NGOs working in the education sector. They broke the link that a teacher must have a BA degree. So long as they had passed school, you could go through this. There was a training program, and the promise was that if the panchayat passed a resolution saying they have 25 plus children who want a school, we have identified a young person from the panchayat who will be the teacher, and we are willing to find some place. It could be under the tree, it could be in the landlord's veranda, it could be anywhere. Then within 90 days, a school would be set up. And this is called the Education Guarantee Scheme. And to my amazement, about 28,000 schools were set up over a period of 2 years under this. I visited a large number. There have been a large number of evaluations done by others. And the Gurujis were people who had hopefully passed +2, often had not had passed 10th class, but whose training at that particular level of literacy was basically how to deal with a child who is crying, how to deal with children who are squabbling, and the basic rules being you don't hit children, you deal with them with sympathy. And then the training in the alphabets and the numbers and so on. The amazing thing is that bypassing the education department schools, setting up what, of course, for Digvijay Singh it was useful because he called them Rajiv Gandhi Shalas, and the Rajiv Gandhi Shala in every village would pay political dividends. He got re-elected. I mean, it was not something that was expected. Maybe politically he knew what he was doing. But this particular method was an innovation which broke with several existing. The teacher must be a B.Ed, must belong to the education department. These Gurujis were at the beginning paid only a stipend of 500 rupees. They were given that title, they were given the training, but they couldn't run away because the stipend would not be released if the Sarpanch found he was not teaching. He belonged to the village, parents and everybody could talk to him. And this title of Guruji gave him a status that he would never have had anyway. So bypass the entire education department, the unions, the teachers' unions, everything else, created working schools, and the census tells the story of what was happened. That was to catch the young. 28,000 such schools, which is quite an unbelievable achievement, funded from the regular education budget without any extra money, no DPP, nothing. The regular education budget of the state, which was diverted whenever a school came in. At the other end, there was what they call the Padna Badna program, which was to catch the adults. The object again is that they should pass the standard exams on the minimal levels of learning. And they always talk of teaching learning material, not teaching material. And the teaching material that they develop for the children is more or less the same that was used in the adult program. But they got the adults organized into groups so that there'd be groups of 5 or 10 people in a village, organized by themselves. They were encouraged to form. Anyone in the village who was willing to teach them was authorized to teach them. The only thing was that they had to take a test, and the test had to be passed before anybody would be declared literate, and there they had a machinery to ensure that. The government only said that everyone, any adult who passed this exam would be given 100 rupees, which can give as Guru Dakshina to whoever taught them. That was the only incentive in the entire process. But in small villages where there were a lot of retired people from various departments, teachers and so on, many people took up the challenge. And this was run as a campaign for just 1 year. Maybe you can say that again, the political system was playing up. They knew the census was coming and people should be literate by the time of the census. Perhaps it is politics. If you go now to Madhya Pradesh and see if they are still literate, I don't know what you will find. And there is a problem of what Sharda Prasad once called post-literacy illiteracy, because they become literate, they've passed an exam, and 6 months down the line, they've forgotten how to read and write. I do not know about that. But the point I'm trying to make is that there were innovations made in the way these programs, a basic idea was taken, what was replicated was the teaching learning material, the textbooks, but the way in which instruction was imparted and the context in which it was given, the scale in which it was done was extremely different, and the result, at least according to the census, is a state which has made dramatic changes, particularly in female literacy. Now, here I think the success lies in the fact of creative innovation and not in replication of a model. I'd like to take another example which is much more mundane. It comes from economics. We are in a time of major economic reform, and the driving force behind this economic reform is a theory called the Washington Consensus, largely promoted by the IMF. And the International Monetary Fund has a very simple thing. They're in the business of making sure that world trade takes place smoothly, and when there are perturbations of some sort, they step in. And usually they step in when some country runs into a balance of payments crisis, cannot pay for its imports, cannot pay its debts, and then various things seem to follow. Now, the package of measures that the IMF recommends is pretty standard. The first thing that they tell you, they look at the balance of payment. Balance of payment should be set right, sort of reduce your imports, increase your exports if you can. In order to do that, devalue your currency, because your goods would be cheaper abroad once you devalue your currency, and also by the same token, imports would become more expensive, and the market mechanism will therefore lead to the required changes in the import-export mix. And at the national level, since the balance of payments is often related to the national financial condition, balance your budget. Let the government live within its means. It sounds very reasonable. Sounds extremely reasonable. But the trick comes in the fact that the Washington Consensus defines this government budget balance in terms of what is called the fiscal deficit. Now, I managed to get to the Delhi School of Economics and got a master's degree without ever having heard of the fiscal deficit. It's something of a recent 90s phenomenon. And the reason for that is the kind of definition that is used. On the one hand, the revenues of the government are taken together. It's all the tax that the government collects, fines, taxes, whatever, indirect taxes, direct taxes. There is some sum that is the revenue of the government. On this, there is no dispute between any World Bank, economists, and that's the revenues of the government. But what are the expenditures of the government? Normally speaking, the expenditures of the government are the direct government departments and the programs that it runs. But in the fiscal deficit, you add any agency that gets any kind of a government grant or which is in some vague way government. So the expenditures of the Indian Institute of Science would be an expenditure of the government of India in calculating the fiscal deficit. The finances of BHEL, HMT, ITI, all of them would appear. So it broadens what is government expenditure to include any entity which in any sense has the stamp of government on it, stamp of government, union government, state government, whatever, and adds their expenditures into this. And the recommendation that is then made is that since the revenue thus defined is less than the expenditure thus defined, there is a fiscal deficit and that fiscal deficit should be cut down. How is that to be done? I think the quickest way on that is for the government to chop its various ancillary activities, chop its grant to the Indian Institute of Science, chop its grants to BHEL, ITI, various bodies, because the core government, which is the various departments, agriculture, industry, and so on, are manned by permanent civil servants. You can't do very much about it. The maximum you say somebody retires, we don't replace him or her, but that's about it. There's very little scope for it. There is no question of adjusting your expenditures by saying you cut down on defense. In fact, after a structural adjustment program, I don't know any country where defense has been cut down. What has happened sometimes, and India is a case of it, is that the rate of increase of defense expenditure has come down. But now, one can argue whether that is the right priority or not. So in this sense, the fiscal deficit is then defined in a certain ideological way, because underlying this is the view that that government is best which governs least. It's the business of government to provide, foreign relations, ambassadors, defense, law and order, but nothing else. Education, health, all these things are best in the private sector. Govern less, get out of these particular activities, and then you will balance your budget. It's consistent with the free market logic that is the dominant ideology behind the Washington Consensus. It's never put that way. It's put in terms of the economic argument of balanced budgets and so on. Now, why is it that I call this ideological? How have economists been defining budgets earlier? I think, as I said, there is no dispute on what is revenue. It is the taxes that are collected. But the standard definition of a government budget is the government of India is an entity which presents a budget in parliament, and the expenditures that the parliament votes on are the expenditures of the government of India, nothing else. And that is called the revenue deficit. If the parliament votes for expenditures more than the revenues that it gets that year, that little bit is the deficit, not the losses of BHEL and various things which are separate legal entities and separated out. Now, in this sense, what is important for countries like India is that the government has a balance between its current revenues and its current expenditures in the narrower sense of expenditure that have. India is a country which, from independence until 1981, had a policy by which its tax revenues were greater than the revenue expenditures of the government, and the surplus was used to create all your public sector industry. Yes, there were some foreign loans, there was some added to it, but HMT was set up because there were, between a given year's expenditure by the government and the tax revenues it collected, there was a surplus. And this surplus was utilized to create industrial capacity or the Green Revolution or various things that the government did over a period of time. So in that sense, the government was investing. And these were created on that particular basis. It's after 81 that it changed. It's 81 that we took the first loan from the IMF. And later on, the government got into a system of borrowing, then came 91 with a whole lot of policies, and by then the term fiscal deficit. Now, the question that I would ask about it is that even if you say you accept the regime of the fiscal deficit, 91 was a crisis year. Today nobody talks of a crisis. We're 12 years down the line, things are all right. But if you look at the Washington Consensus recommendations of cut the fiscal deficit, today's fiscal deficit is larger in percentage terms than was the fiscal deficit in 91, which was a crisis year. Today's revenue deficit shows that the economy is in much worse shape than it was in 91. 91, the revenue deficit was a small amount, something of the order of, if I remember correctly, 200 crores or something. Now it's 20,000 crores. That is because if you add up the union and the states and so on, you get a certain picture of it. But here is the Washington Consensus, which is based upon a certain theory of free market economy and so on, which makes a recommendation to a country like India, which ran into a temporary crisis in the balance of payments, but led to major changes in the way government functions. At the end of 12 years, people say that the Indian economy is growing, we're in another Asian tiger, all kinds of things are said. But the key test of this is these parameters, the size of the fiscal deficit, which is worse today than it was in 91. Why is the economy not in a crisis? I think the changes are in the ideological sphere. This is much more of a market-oriented economy. There is less of so-called socialism. There is greater market confidence. Foreign money is coming in. Things have changed compared to the 1990s. But we're still fortunate in that while there has been no improvement in the fiscal deficit, the crisis has gone for various kinds of reasons. The Washington Consensus package is a standard package that has been applied in various African countries, Latin American countries, and elsewhere. Always the same thing. Devalue your currency, reduce the fiscal deficit. These are the two items. Look at what has happened to Argentina, or what happened to Mexico, what happened to some countries in Korea. Countries, the East Asian countries which faced a crisis, never had deficit budgets. In their case, the crisis came because of speculative capital outflows. There was a sudden fear that the loss of confidence in the economy, money went out in moments, so that billions of dollars flew out of Bangkok, out of Kuala Lumpur, and so on. And this led to an imbalance in the settlement of accounts. The governments had surplus budgets. There was no long-term crisis. It was speculation in things like real estate and the real estate market collapsing that led to this kind of situation. But the recommendation is the same. Devalue. Thailand was forced to devalue. Malaysia, Korea, they were all forced to devalue. Indonesia. Devalue your currency, reduce your fiscal deficit, let government get out. But look at the outcomes. In each of these cases, the outcome is totally different. Some are still in crisis, some have got out of it. We are not in crisis, but we are not out of that fiscal deficit mess in terms of the key parameters. One can go into a large analysis to why this happened, why we are not in serious problems, and so on. Well, the short answer to that is very simple. This country still depends on the monsoon, and the weather gods have been very kind to the economic reforms process, because the first 9 years of the economic had bumper monsoon so that there was no crisis in agriculture. And so long as there is no crisis in agricultural production, labor in agriculture, wages don't fall, there's purchasing power, you go through that. So that basically, it was an exogenous factor completely out of control of the kindness of the weather gods. Now, I've given two kinds of examples to try and show that when in disciplines like economics or in a larger social science context, we go by the replication model, draw an experience which is valid somewhere, get a theory about it, put it in the form of a particular proposition and recommendation, so do A, B, C, and then try to replicate it, forgetting context. We don't seem to get anywhere. Where we seem to succeed is on some basic principle, the importance of literacy, or the importance of balancing your budget. Some of these are taken, but then the steps that are followed are appropriate to the local context, within the capacity of the local administration to implement them, then there might be some kind of possibility of success. So it's not a question of replicating an experiment, it's not a question of replicating a program, It's a question of taking certain basic ideas, working with them creatively and innovatively, and coming in with your own unique structure where the elements may be the same, but the mix of elements is different, and you proceed forward. So that is not, in my view, repeating an experiment or replicating a particular success story somewhere. It is learning from the fact that in a historical process, you have a specific time when things work. And as Marx said, history repeats itself, first as a farce and then as a tragedy. In the historical processes, there is no replication. It's a question of creatively innovating and finding new solutions to perhaps old problems, but in your own context. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.
You gave two examples which were very, very interesting. And in fact, I think we could talk with you for hours on each of these, the literacy and the economic case, certainly. As a die-hard person who is on the other side, so to speak, about repeatability and falsifiability and so on, I would like a little further case to be made, because in each case, what happens is each system has a dimension. And what it says is that it's not enough to look at only part of it. If you're looking at a swing, some child on a swing, it's not enough to know where the child is, you want to know what speed it is going. By the time you know the position and the speed, now you can predict. Now it turns out clearly that you needed to have many more parameters to predict the literacy experiment. Certainly the percentage of the literate people, the seed people, seed capital would be very, very important, clearly in the example that you gave. So essentially what it says is that you need, first of all, to understand that the social problems, sociological problems have a larger dimension than the dimension that you have in physical sciences, many cases. That's one thing. Second, not all prediction has to be precise. It can also be probabilistic. There's a company called Prediction in Santa Fe that actually predicts, movement of the various things and so on and so forth. Third thing is there is an article in Chronicle of Higher Education that came about 20 years ago that criticized especially economics for not having this perspective. Just if you decide to have this discipline of saying, all these theories that come out of, and sometimes they're to me rather ridiculous from a mathematical point of view. Chicago School, a large part of Chicago School, including the founder, the economics to me, from logical point of view, doesn't actually make sense. So then, they tried experiment, they tried Chile, and that is in fact very interesting. That's the first time they said, let's do some experiment. The Chicago boys went to Chile, and that was a tragedy rather than the comical farce as you're talking about. So if social scientists develop this discipline, I know it's hard to do, that we need to have some replicability. I think they might then find these other hidden parameters that they have not been aware of. And in fact, the sciences might go a little bit further. I'm sorry to make such a long comment, but I'd like to hear your views on this.
I don't think we differ too much. It's a question of the scale on which you're working. If you're talking of, basically what I had in mind was developmental problems. I wasn't looking at all problems of society. If you're looking at development problems, I think that we are not even sure of all the parameters. Now, as far as the discipline of economics is concerned, it's a very wide discipline. But unlike some of the natural sciences, there are bodies of knowledge that build up in particular contexts. The Chicago School is a unique one. It's had more Nobel Prizes than any other. But if you go to the Chicago School and go by their logic, there is no such thing as poverty. And yet we know in this country that is an overriding problem. And if you want to know anything with the research on poverty, this is the country where the work has been done. We are very rich on research on poverty. And if any American economist wants to do it, he has to come to India and study the various Indian economists or the few Indian economists in the United States. Now, they work with a framework that doesn't even recognize something which to us is a very large reality. So obviously the questions of replicability will not arise because the frameworks are not, and I think part of the point I'm making is that a discipline like economics in that sense consists of bodies of knowledge in various places. But what you take from which is still something that has to be very clearly looked at, and the eclectic mixes should also have a logical consistency. That's an important point. But the application in different contexts should also be very carefully looked at. And we have been rather poor at that, unfortunately. For example, Indian planning in its heyday had perhaps the most complex planning models anywhere in the world. We were world leaders in that kind of research. But we've not had very much success with them because I think we made certain simplifications, and it is the probabilistic kind, and things happened that you couldn't. No plan model talked of the war with Pakistan or China or the breakup of Bangladesh. And that led to certain changes which models couldn't deal with. But today we don't even pretend to have those models, which is a pity. But I think had we continued with that, that research would have been standing us in good stead today to understand the various relationships better. No, I would say it's very important to have